Okay, so this lesson is on how to start your story. You're writing the beginning of a sequel to the Red Pyramid. Okay, so the premise of the Red Pyramid, of course, is that it's a recording, right? It's a written transcript of a recording. You do not have to write your story that way. You're writing it from a totally different character's point of view, so you can choose a different method or different kind of premise set up for your story. But there are, in essence, kind of 9 ways that you can start a story. So the first one is with an it was, it is, this is type of start. Chapter 6, when Carter goes on a bad trip, gives you an example of this. How to describe it: not a nightmare, it was more real and frightening. So that's kind of one way to grab attention and start a chapter to a story. The second way is viewpoint on life. Sadie does this kind of a lot, Carter a little bit. Chapter 4 is a really good example of this from Sadie's narrating. I just love family meetings, very cozy with Christmas garlands around the fireplace, a nice pot of tea, and a detective from Scotland Yard to arrest you. So here it's sarcastic, so we're getting her viewpoint on family meetings and kind of her life in general at the moment. Mid-action, so when I woke up, the police were rushing about as you might expect. They separated me from my brother. This is at the beginning of chapter 3. And so that's kind of an example of how you kind of start with just action taking place. You can also start with spoken word or dialogue. He doesn't do this a lot in this book. But he does. Chapter 34 is an example. I summoned Dad's magic toolkit out of the doo-wah and grabbed our little legless friend. Doughboy, we need to talk. He usually puts dialogue pretty soon in the chapter, not always, but a lot of chapters. But there's usually an additional method that he uses at the beginning of the chapter other than just dialogue. But chapter 34, he does put dialogue in that very first paragraph. Chapter 7, if you want to look at the beginning of that one, would be sort of another example. So you get a viewpoint of life from Sadie, right? So it's kind of a combination of 2 and 4. She's saying that, honestly, if somebody's forbidding you to do something, then there's a good chance worth doing. And then Carter speaks, right? Hold on. So if you want to look at that as an example, that would be another example of combining 2 and 4 together. Okay, so number 5 would be setup. So the whole first part of our story is setup. Okay, so he starts the novel using setup primarily. And that is just, setting up the situation for the reader. In this case, it was an audio recording. We only have a few hours, so listen carefully, right? And it pulls us right into the story, makes us part of the story from the very beginning with the setup. Landscape would be starting with setting. Okay, so it doesn't have to be landscape, can be any setting. The museum was completely closed and completely dark, but the curator and 2 security guards were waiting for us on the front steps. That's the beginning of chapter 2. Also the beginning of chapter 14. The last couple of days I'd seen a lot of crazy things, but the Hall of Ages took the prize, and then he goes right into description of the Hall of Ages. So that was really good. Chapter 26 with the boat and the description of the Egyptian queen at the beginning also is a good example of that. Let's Meet Jack and Jill is let's meet the main character in your story. In this case, there's more than one, the person telling the story. So, and he combines Let's Meet Jack and Jill with setup in chapter 1. So if you're hearing the story, you're already in danger. Sadie and I might be your only chance. So we immediately know, like, Sadie's part of the story right from the beginning. And we meet the characters of Carter and Sadie within the setup. Another example would be chapter 15. Sadie's narrating, they took Carter to a different dormitory, so I don't know how he slept, but I couldn't get a wink. So again, the beginning of the chapter is focusing on the characters and what's going on with the characters, as opposed to action or setting or something else. 8 is Let's Meet Joe, my friend. So you're not going to focus on the main narrators of the story, but on a friend of the narrators. Chapter 8 starts with, so yeah, our cat was a goddess. So that would be an example of that, right? Introducing us to Bast. And then method 9 would be I am, right? So where the character is introducing himself or herself. And again, this goes on in chapter 1. My name is Carter Kane. I'm 14 years old and my home is a suitcase. So that would be an example of I am. It switches from setup and Let's Meet Jack and Jill to I Am. They're on page 2. Okay, so these are 9 ways that you can start a story. You can use the focus on one or use a couple to get started. The important thing is once you start, you want to get the characters, your character introduced and the situation, the setting within the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. Okay, so when you are writing a narrative or a story, right, writing the start of a sequel to the Red Pyramid, you want to make sure that you're writing in paragraphs always. So when you should begin a new paragraph. So the obvious one that I think most of you learned is that when the character who is speaking changes, you start a new paragraph, even if it's one word. Or one sentence, right? Or part of a sentence. It doesn't matter. If the character who is speaking changes, because you have dialogue going back and forth, you start a new paragraph each and every time. But there are some other places where you want to also start a new paragraph. So when a new character enters the scene, so if you're discussing something and a character arrives, you want to start a new paragraph. When a character leaves the scene, you want to start a new paragraph. Okay, so they leave, start a new paragraph. When the scene or location changes, so if you're going from one setting to another setting, they go from one room into another room, they go through a portal, you want to start a new paragraph. And then when the focus of the narration changes, so you can kind of think of it as, you know, like if you were making a movie, is the camera switching focus? Is it zooming in, zooming out, switching from one thing to another thing? So if you're going from dialogue to description, and I don't mean description relevant to the person speaking, because then you wouldn't necessarily want to start a new paragraph, but if you're going from the person speaking and you're switching the focus of your description to a different character or to the setting, then you would want to start a new paragraph. If you're going from description to dialogue, and you weren't describing that character who's speaking, so you're describing something else and then a new character is going to start to speak, you want to start a new paragraph. If you are describing action, right, and then you're going to switch to a description of the setting that's not interwoven. So we've looked at how it's interwoven, but it's not always interwoven. Sometimes you've got action going on and then the characters walk into a room and now you want to just describe the room, right? And all you're going to do is describe the room. You would make that its own paragraph. Or let's say that you were in the room and a character, now you're going to switch and you're going to describe a character who's in the room. You would want to start a new paragraph. Description of action to setting or character, character to setting or action, or setting to character or action. So anytime you're kind of switching that focus, you want to start a new paragraph. So if you have any questions, we're certainly happy to help you as you're writing. So if you want to know, should I start a new paragraph here or not, I'll be available to help you with that.